Cody and I didn't fight much when we were little. That's what I remember anyway. He was 7 years younger, so the age gap worked like a kind of buffer. I wasn't about to get into it with someone who still wore Velcro sneakers, and he respected me the specific way kids respect someone who seems distant and capable. We got along precisely because there was no expectation of closeness. It wasn't until we got older that things got complicated, because then it became comparison. And comparison between brothers is always bad math. The last time we'd actually talked before the fight was at my mom's birthday, in March. Cody showed up at her place in Buckhannon with Renata, who'd been his girlfriend for about 2 years, and I remember thinking the two of them looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. She was quiet all through lunch. He was restless, getting up to grab water he never drank, checking his phone for no obvious reason. My mom asked if he was doing okay. He said he was, in the tone of someone who is nowhere close to okay, and nobody pushed it because in our family we learned early on that pushing is the same as accusing. By the time the distance started in May, I already knew some things through Renata, who'd texted me because she didn't know what else to do. Cody was living alone on a leased property outside Helvetia, a small rural community I knew by name, but had never visited. It's deep in Randolph County, out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods and roads that GPS treats as optional. He'd started working as a freelance painter in the area and chose to live close to his clients. At least that's what he said. Renata told me he had changed before he changed addresses. That he'd stopped sleeping right, started keeping the windows shut even in the heat, and that 2 weeks before she left, he woke up in the middle of the night and stood at the edge of the bed listening to something she couldn't hear. She asked what it was. He said nothing, go back to sleep, but he stayed up until morning. I heard all of that and thought, Cody always was dramatic. Not in an annoying way, but in a way I never quite understood. He felt things on a bigger scale than necessary, always needed more emotional room than the situation called for, and I, who had spent my entire adult life 40 meters up on transmission towers learning not to react to the wind, never really knew how to handle that. Renata had probably left because he was going through something, and he was probably going through something because she left. That kind of cycle I'd seen before. The call that turned into a fight was on a Thursday night, early June. I was home, had just finished dinner, and my phone rang with Cody's number. He didn't call often. We mostly communicated by text, so I picked up figuring it was something practical. He needed money, or something had happened with our mom. It was neither. He started by saying there was something moving around the property at night. That for the past 3 days, always after midnight, he'd been hearing something coming from outside the barn about 40 yards from the house. That the neighbor's dog, which barked at every car that passed on the road, had gone completely silent on the nights the sound showed up. He said all of this in a voice I can only describe as too controlled, the way someone talks when they've rehearsed what they're going to say because they already know the reaction won't be good. I asked what the sound was. He said it was hard to explain, that it was like something scratching on wood but with weight behind it, that sometimes it was just breathing, but wider than it should be. I asked if he'd gone out to check. He said no. Then I made the mistake I sometimes make, which is saying what I think without enough of a filter. I told him he was probably hearing a deer or a young bear, that the area had dense wildlife, and that hiding inside because of nighttime noises in a rural area was exactly the kind of thing that happened when someone wasn't used to living away from the city. I said it without cruelty, but without care either. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said it wasn't an animal, that he knew the difference, that the sound stopped when he turned the lights on and came back when he turned them off, and that wasn't the behavior of any animal he'd ever heard. I said animals react to light. That was basic. He said I wasn't listening. I said I was listening. That the problem was what I was hearing didn't make sense, and that maybe he needed to talk to someone. Not because of the sound, but because of everything else. The sleep, the isolation, Renata, all of it that came before. He hung up. I sat there looking at my phone for a while with that lousy feeling you get when you said the right thing in completely the wrong way. I did the dishes. Watched half of some show I can't even remember. Before bed, I texted him saying not to take what I said the wrong way, that I was just worried. He didn't respond that night, or the next. A week went by with no answer, and I decided he needed space and I'd give it to him. Another week passed. My mom called asking if I'd talked to him, and I said I had, that everything was fine because it was easier than explaining. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Cody had called her the week before and seemed off, that he'd asked if she believed some things had no explanation. She said she did. He said great and hung up. I'm not entirely sure what I felt when I heard that. Something between irritation and something that isn't quite guilt but sits close to it. I called Renata on a Monday morning before heading to work. I was in the parking lot of the depot in Weston, coffee going cold in the cup holder, and 20 minutes before I had to hit the road, and I decided I'd waited long enough. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was either expecting a call or wasn't sleeping right. I asked how she was doing. She said fine, in the same tone Cody had used at my mom's birthday. That fine, that means the person has already decided they're not getting into it. I asked about him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel, I left because I couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't one thing. It was everything at once." I said I understood, that I wasn't calling to judge anything, that I just wanted to know where he was at before I tried reaching out again. She took a deep breath and started talking. What she described was a Cody I recognized in parts and didn't in others. The Cody she'd met was scattered, emotional, sometimes exhausting, but present. The Cody of the last few months before she left was something else, closed off, hyper-vigilant, waking up in the middle of the night without being able to explain why. She said at first she thought it was stress from the new job, from the move to Helvetia, from adjusting. Then she thought it was depression. Then she stopped trying to label it because whatever label she suggested he'd brush off. What he kept saying was that there was something out there. She said it in a tired way, not a doubtful way, but the way someone says something they've repeated to themselves so many times it's lost all texture. I asked when he'd first started talking about it. She explained he'd already been different before the move. More withdrawn, more irritable, more distant. But talking about something out there specifically that only started after Helvetia. She thought about it, said the first time he mentioned it was about 3 weeks after they moved to the property. He'd woken up at 2 in the morning and stood at the window for almost an hour. She woke up and asked what was going on. He said he'd heard something outside the barn. She listened. There was nothing. They went back to sleep, but he kept waking up. She said the pattern was always the same. Between midnight and 3 in the morning, he'd wake up, go still, and listen. Sometimes he'd get up and go to the window. Never went outside. She asked him once why he didn't just go out and check, and he said he didn't want to draw attention to himself. She didn't understand what that meant at the time. Still didn't when she called me. I asked if she'd ever heard anything herself. She went quiet again, then said once. But I don't know what it was. She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. What stayed with me from that conversation wasn't any specific piece of information. It was her tone. Renata is a practical woman. She works as an X-ray tech at a hospital in Elkins, deals with bad things all the time without losing her footing. And she was talking about Cody with a weariness that wasn't just relationship fatigue. It was the weariness of someone who had spent a long time trying not to believe something and wasn't sure they'd managed it. I filed that detail away and kept doing nothing with it. That week I was working a stretch of transmission towers in Randolph County, routine inspection after a storm that had bent 2 supports. The work demands the kind of concentration that leaves no room for anything else. You're 30, 40 feet off the ground, with crosswind, checking every connection point, and anything that isn't that tower at that moment is a liability. I like that. Always have. There's a clarity to it that life on the ground rarely offers. It was during that week that my mom called again. She said Cody had shown up at her place the evening before, unannounced, at 8 o'clock at night. Stayed just over an hour, had some coffee, said very little. She told me he looked like he'd lost weight, that the circles under his eyes were deep, and at some point she asked if he was eating right, and he gave her an answer that wasn't really an answer. Before he left, he asked if she remembered a story their dad had told once about something their grandfather had seen in a forest in Kentucky. My mom said she didn't remember any story like that. He said it was fine, must have been his mistake, and left. After she hung up, I kept thinking about that story. I didn't remember one either. Our dad died when Cody was 16, and a lot of what he said was fragmented like that. Half-told stories, references with no context. It was possible there was something he'd told only Cody, who was the youngest, the one who stayed home longer while I was already out working. It was also possible that Cody was in a state where he was making connections where there weren't any. I went with the second option. It was simpler. What finally made me decide to go to Helvetia wasn't any dramatic phone call. It was the silence. Cody went 11 days without any sign of life. Didn't answer texts, didn't pick up, didn't show up anywhere. My mom started calling me with a frequency she only uses when she's genuinely scared, and I know my mom well enough to know her instincts are calibrated. She doesn't panic out of habit. I tried calling him on the night of the 11th day. It rang 6 times. On the 7th, he picked up. He said hey in a voice that sounded like he'd just woken up, but it was 8 at night. I said I was worried, that we needed to talk, that I wanted to come out there that weekend. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "You're not going to believe me anyway." I said I would. He said, "Fine. Come on out." And he hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there holding my phone in the bedroom, TV on with no sound because I'd forgotten to turn it off. There was a water bottle on the nightstand that I didn't remember putting there, but I had put it there. Of course I had. Except for some reason in that moment, I stood there staring at it like it was a question I didn't know how to ask. I went to bed late and woke up before my alarm, which isn't like me. I left Weston early on a Friday, car topped off with gas and a mental list of things I was going to say to Cody when I got there. I'd rehearsed it during the week. Not the exact words, but the general logic. I was going to listen. Let him talk without cutting in. Ask if he'd been sleeping, if he was eating, if he'd thought about talking to someone, and only then, carefully, suggest that maybe the problem wasn't what he thought it was. It was a reasonable plan. I felt good about it. The road to Helvetia isn't hard, but it demands attention. You get off the 33 at a point the GPS announces with a confidence the road doesn't deserve. And from there, it's bad asphalt that turns to gravel that turns into a single lane between tall trees that block the light even in the morning. I've worked in remote areas my whole life, so that kind of landscape doesn't bother me. But there's a difference between being up on a tower in the middle of open land and driving through dense forest. On the tower, you can see everything. On the road, you can see to the next bend. Helvetia itself is too small to call a town. There's a restaurant that's open on specific days, a church, a handful of houses scattered around, and the kind of silence that people from the city read as peaceful, and people who grew up in places like that know isn't quite that. It's just absence. The property Cody was leasing sat about 4 miles from the center, down an unnamed road that showed up on the map as a dotted line. When I arrived, it was close to 10 in the morning. The house was smaller than I'd pictured. A wood-frame building painted white long enough ago that the paint was peeling in wide strips. 2 bedrooms at most, a front porch with a green plastic chair lying on its side on the floor. The barn was set back behind the house, separated from it by about 40 yards of open ground, exactly the way Cody had described. It was an old structure, dark weathered boards with the side door held shut by a chain that looked new compared to everything else. Cody opened the front door before I'd even parked. He was standing on the porch with his arms crossed, and it took me a second to read the posture because it wasn't defensive. It was someone who was cold, even though the morning wasn't cold. I got out of the car and said, "Hey," he said, "Hey." We hugged the way we hug, which is quick and with a couple slaps on the back, and I could tell he'd actually lost weight. Renata had been right. His collarbones were more prominent, his face was narrower, and the dark circles my mom had mentioned were deep enough to look structural. He made coffee. The kitchen was small and smelled like damp wood and something I couldn't identify right away. I later associated it with cleaning product used in excess, the kind of smell you get when someone scrubs a surface more than they need to. The sink was too clean. The table, too. There was a portable radio on top of the refrigerator playing low, tuned to a country station I didn't recognize, and the radio had the finger smudges of something handled often. I didn't ask about the radio right then. I asked later, coffee already in hand, in the most casual tone I could manage. He said he kept it on to have some steady sound inside the house. I said I understood, which was a lie, but it wasn't the moment. The conversation started with practical things. The painting work, the clients in the area, whether the house kept warm in winter. He answered everything with the word economy of someone responding exactly what was asked, and not one syllable more. I let it go. Ate 2 cookies from a box he put on the table. Some brand I didn't recognize, probably from a local store. It was only when the coffee was finished that he said, "You want to see the barn?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. We went out the back door. The ground between the house and the barn was packed dirt with sparse grass growing along the edges, and there was an informal path down the middle, the kind that forms when the same person walks the same route enough times. But the path stopped about 15 yards from the barn. Beyond that, the ground was undisturbed. I looked at the path and then at him. He said, "I don't get any closer than this during the day." I asked why. He took a while to answer. Said he couldn't explain it right. That during the day the barn looked normal, and that was exactly what bothered him, because at night it wasn't. I looked at the barn for a while. It was an ordinary structure. Side door with the new chain, one small window set too high to be useful. A rusted metal roof with one sheet lifted at the corner. From where I stood I could see marks on the wood of the side wall, long, irregular ones that I first took for weather damage, then looked more carefully and wasn't sure. I asked what those marks were. He said he didn't know, that they hadn't been there when he moved in. I wanted to get closer to look. He didn't say anything when I took the first few steps, but when I was about 5 yards from the barn, I heard him say behind me, in a low voice, "Daniel." I stopped. He said, "You don't have to." I went back. Not because I was scared, I wasn't, not yet, but because his tone was that of someone asking a small favor, and it cost me little to oblige. We went back inside. He made more coffee that neither of us drank. We sat for a while without saying much, radio in the background, and I slowly started noticing that he was listening. Not to us, to the outside. His eyes did it at irregular intervals, drifted slightly toward the window, came back, drifted again. He didn't seem to realize he was doing it, or he did and couldn't stop. I said I'd stay the night, that I could sleep on the couch. He said the couch was uncomfortable. I said I'd slept on worse. He looked at me for a moment, not with gratitude exactly, with something more complicated than that, something that included some residue from the fight, and something that might have been relief and might have been the opposite. He said, "Okay." That afternoon, while he was out for a quick visit to a client, I went to my car to grab my bag and stood outside for a few minutes, looking at the barn from a distance. The lifted sheet of metal at the corner of the roof moved slightly in the wind. The ground around the barn was still. A bird singing somewhere in a tree I couldn't see. Everything completely normal. I went inside, dropped my bag on the couch, and turned on my own radio from my phone, just to have some sound. Cody got back around 5 in the afternoon with a grocery bag and his jacket zipped up to his throat despite the weather being only mildly cool. He'd bought chicken, rice, a can of peas, and 2 beers, which struck me as a menu chosen by someone who wasn't thinking about food in any real sense, just filling in the basic fields. He cooked without talking much, stirring the pot with a focus disproportionate to the task, and the radio stayed on the whole time. I sat at the table watching without looking like I was watching, which is a skill I developed over years of equipment inspection. You learn to register things without showing that you're registering them, because sometimes the thing you need to see only appears when nobody's looking at it directly. What I registered was this. Cody didn't turn his back to the window, not dramatically, not in a way that seemed intentional, but whenever he moved around the kitchen, there was an angle he kept. The back window, the one that faced the yard and the barn, was always within his peripheral field of vision. When he reached up for the can of peas in the high cabinet, He turned in a slightly awkward way, unnecessary, that kept that side of the room visible. I didn't say anything. We ate. The food was good enough. He drank his beer slowly, and I drank half of mine and left the rest because I was never much of a beer with dinner person, and this wasn't the moment to pretend. At some point he asked how work was going, and I told him about the towers in Randolph County, the storm, a support beam that had twisted in a way the engineer found interesting from a structural standpoint, but that in practice meant 8 extra hours of work in the cold. He listened, asked a question or two that showed he was actually paying attention. For a moment it felt like a normal visit. After dinner he washed the dishes while I dried, and it was during that Earl Dunning knocked on the door. I didn't know who he was. Cody went to answer, and I heard an old raspy voice, the kind that had smoked for decades and quit too late to make a difference. The man who came in was around 70, with rounded shoulders and a straight-brimmed cap with the faded logo of some agricultural co-op. He looked at me with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of someone who lives far enough from other people that social niceties have become optional. Cody said, "This is my brother Daniel. Earl's my neighbor. His property's about half a mile east." Earl shook my hand, firm grip, calloused palm. He said, "Figured you'd show up here sooner or later." I said I didn't know I was that predictable. He gave a kind of smile that had no humor in it, just recognition. He looked at Cody and said his dogs had gone quiet again the night before. Said it the way you'd report the weather. No emphasis, no alarm. Like practical information between people who share a context. Cody nodded slowly. Earl looked at me, said, "Your brother told me what's been going on here. I don't know what it is. But my dogs know something, and they don't go quiet for nothing. There are 3 of them, and when all 3 stop at the same time, I pay attention." I asked how often they'd stopped. He thought about it, said, 7, 8 times in the last month and a half. Always after midnight. Always start up again when the sun begins to come up. I said animals had cycles, that there were plenty of possible explanations. He looked at me with a patience that was almost kind. He said, "Son, I've had dogs for 40 years. I know their cycles better than my own. This isn't a cycle." He stayed another 10 minutes or so, turned down coffee, and left with the same unhurried step he'd arrived with. When the door closed, I waited for Cody to say something. Some version of "I told you so," some small victory. He didn't say anything. He went to the back window, looked out at the yard darkening outside, and stood there for a while. I finished washing the dishes alone. When it got fully dark, Cody turned on every light inside the house, not just the ones that were needed. All of them. The hallway light, the bathroom light, the light in the empty room he used to store painting supplies. The house lit up with an intensity that felt less like comfort and more like a statement. I didn't say anything. Around 9, he said he was going to bed, that he got up early, and that I could use the bathroom first. I did. Came back, and he'd already gone into his room. The door didn't lock. I heard him try and give up, which told me the latch was either broken or stuck. He left it open a crack. I settled onto the couch with a blanket that smelled like it had been in storage and scrolled through my phone for a while without being able to focus on anything. Outside, it was quiet. Wind in the trees, some insect, the minimal sounds of an old house settling in the night's temperature. A little past 11, I turned off the screen and closed my eyes. I don't know how much time passed. What I know is that I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was the kind of waking that happens when something in the environment shifts in a way too subtle to be processed consciously, but enough to interrupt sleep. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. The house was quiet. The radio had turned itself off at some point. Must have had a timer I didn't know about. Without it, the silence inside the house was dense in a way apartment silence never is. Rural silence has its own texture, its own layers, has the small, constant sounds you only notice when one of them stops. And one had stopped. I couldn't identify which one. I only know that the silence present when I woke up was different from the silence that should have been there. More compressed, closer in, as if the sound space outside had closed itself around something I couldn't name. I lay still for maybe 3 minutes. Nothing else happened. The silence gradually came back to its normal texture. Insects, wind, wood. I closed my eyes. But it took longer than it should have to fall back asleep. And when I didn't rest the right way. And in the morning, I woke up with that specific feeling of someone who spent the night on alert without any concrete reason for it. Cody was already up. He was in the kitchen with the coffee ready, sitting at the table, looking out the back window with a cup that was full and cold. I said good morning. He said, "You heard it." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer right away. I grabbed a cup, poured some coffee, sat down on the opposite side of the table. The coffee was too strong, bitter in a way that told you it had been sitting in the thermos long enough to lose any subtlety. I drank it anyway. Cody was still looking out the window. I said, "I heard silence," which is different from hearing something. He turned toward me slowly. Said, "That's exactly it. You understood without meaning to." I was about to respond, but he got up, went to the sink, poured his coffee out, and started rinsing the cup with a focus the task didn't call for. I could tell he wasn't going to elaborate, that he'd said what he wanted to say and was waiting for me to work through it on my own. I spent the morning helping him with something he hadn't asked for help with but clearly needed. The back gutter had come loose from a bracket and was hanging at an angle, pooling water in the wrong spot. I climbed an old ladder I found leaning against the side of the house, reset the bracket with 2 clamps from a toolbox under the sink, came down. 40 minutes of work. Cody stood below holding the ladder even though it didn't need holding. But I understood he needed to be outside doing something with his hands. While I was up there, I could see the barn. From that angle, with the added height, the marks on the side wall were more visible. I studied them for a while pretending to adjust the clamp. They were vertical, parallel in some stretches, with irregular spacing, deep enough to have stripped the surface layer of the wood and exposed the lighter interior beneath. The wood around them was darkened by age and moisture, so the contrast was sharp, those pale lines against a background that was almost black. What unsettled me wasn't the depth, it was the height. The lowest band of marks was at least 8 feet off the ground. I came down the ladder without saying a word about it. That afternoon, Cody went to deliver an estimate to a client in Huttonsville and left me alone for nearly 3 hours. I walked through the house without any particular purpose, which is what I do when I'm processing something, and don't want to admit I'm processing it. I looked at the rooms, the windows, the radio on top of the refrigerator. I went to the back window and stood looking at the barn for a while. The chain on the side door was new. I'd already noticed that. What I hadn't noticed before was that the chain wasn't actually locked. It was looped around the handle and the latch in a way that looked locked from a distance, but up close was just bulk. Anyone who got close enough to examine it would figure that out in 2 seconds. But the chain was on the inside. I turned that detail over in my head without being able to make sense of what it meant. When Cody got back, I didn't ask about the chain. We ate dinner with what was left from the day before, and the conversation flowed easier than the night before. He talked about a client in Helvetia who wanted the entire house painted gray, every wall right up to the ceiling, and how he'd spent 20 minutes trying to talk the man out of it and failed completely. It was a good story, told with the dry humor Cody has when he's feeling lighter, and I laughed for real. For about 40 minutes it felt like everything was fine. Then it got past 10, and he went quiet again. I said I was staying another night. He said, "I know." There was something in the way he said it, not surprise, not relief, just recognition, as if he'd known from the beginning that it would come to this, as if the night before had been a test I didn't know I was taking. This time I didn't try to sleep. I lay on the couch with my eyes open in the dark, the blanket pulled up to my chin, listening to the house. The radio was on at the lowest volume. I'd left it on myself this time. A station playing soft gospel, the kind of music that exists to fill silence without calling attention to itself. It was almost midnight when the radio started cutting out. It didn't turn off. It stayed on, the red light still glowing, but the sound started coming through in fragments. 3 seconds of music, 1 second of static, 2 seconds of music, static again. The pattern was irregular enough that it didn't feel like normal poor reception. Bad signal has its own consistency. This felt like something else, though I couldn't say what. I lay still listening to the static alternate with the gospel for maybe 2 minutes. Then the radio came back on normally. And it was exactly in that moment that I heard the sound from outside. I understand now why Cody had trouble describing it. It's not a sound with a clear category. It's low, but it's not a growl. It has a rhythmic quality, but not regular enough to be mechanical. What came to me in the moment, and this is the kind of thing you think and then feel embarrassed to admit, was that it sounded like air moving through a structure too large for that property. Not exactly breathing, not in any human way, more like pressure entering and leaving a living cavity, with the same low weight of a tensioned cable vibrating before it snaps. I didn't move. The sound was coming from outside, clearly from the direction of the barn. There was a spatial quality to it. It started further to the left and slowly shifted right over maybe 30 seconds, as if something was moving along the outer wall of the barn. Slowly, unhurried. Then it stopped. After that, the ordinary sounds of the night began dropping away in sequence. First the insects, then the wind in the nearest leaves, then even the house's own creaking seemed to go still. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of withdrawal. I counted to 60 without taking a deep breath. Nothing. Counted again. Nothing. I was just starting to let the air out when the sound came back. But this time, it was closer. Not at the barn, at the house. I didn't sit up. Didn't turn on a light. Didn't call out to Cody. I lay absolutely still, blanket still at my chin, listening to that wide, slow breathing move along the outside wall of the living room. From the front window toward the side window. The same window that was less than 6 feet from the couch where I was lying. And it was when the sound stopped for the second time that I understood what Cody had been trying to tell me. It wasn't the sound itself. It was what happened when it stopped. Because it stopped at the exact moment my breathing changed. The precise instant when my body, without my permission, shifted from controlled stillness to something closer to panic. The transition was internal. It was silent. It was imperceptible to any human being 6 feet away. But it wasn't imperceptible to this. The sound stopped as a response. I lay there in the dark with that thought. And the thought was simple and it was terrible. Whatever was outside was paying attention. Not to the noise I was making, to the noise I was about to make. At the border between control and collapse, that millimeter where composure gives way, that was where it was waiting. As if it knew I was awake. As if it knew I was listening. As if it was listening back. I don't know how long I stayed like that. I didn't check the time on my phone. It was face down on the floor next to the couch, and turning it over to check the time meant movement, and movement was an idea my body had completely ruled out. I was lying in the same position I'd been in when the sound came back, blanket at my chin, shoulders locked, and the only thing I could control was the rhythm of my own breathing, which I kept deliberately slow, deliberately shallow, as if I could fool something about my internal state by faking calm on the surface. The sound didn't come back right away. There was a long interval, long enough for me to start rebuilding the rational explanation. Large animal. Wild boar, maybe, which exist in West Virginia and are big enough to make low sounds. Or deer. Or something I wasn't identifying because I was in a heightened state of attention that distorts perception, which I knew from experience distorts perception, because I'd been through it on towers during storms when your ears start filling the silence with sounds that aren't there. I was almost convinced. Then I heard the metal sheet on the barn roof move. It wasn't wind. Wind makes a sheet bang in a repeated and irregular way, the kind of noise that rises and falls with the gusts. This was a single, sustained movement, like weight shifting over a surface, the specific sound of pressure applied from above, of something that was on the roof and changed position. I closed my eyes, not from fear. I closed them because open or closed made no difference in the dark, and closed helped me listen, without the useless effort of trying to see something that wasn't visible. I focused on the sounds with the same precision I use on a tower in high wind, when I need to identify which connection point is vibrating differently from the others. The weight on the barn roof moved again. This time toward the edge. I could tell by the way the sound decreased, as if the pressure was migrating to the point where the roof meets the wall. Then it stopped. What came after was a sequence I can't put in completely the right order because my perception in that moment wasn't operating in a linear way. What I know is that at some point the breathing sound came back, and this time there was no ambiguity about the location. It was outside the side window. The window that was less than 6 feet from me. I didn't open my eyes. The breathing had a quality I tried to rationally dismantle while it was happening, because dismantling is what I do. It's the mechanism I have. It was low. It was slow. The cycle, inhale, pause, exhale, lasted too long to be human. But it wasn't impossible. It wasn't supernatural. It was simply the cycle of something with far greater lung capacity than I was used to associating with anything that moved silently across open ground. There was a wet undercurrent to it, a sound of air passing through something that was not a human nose. Larger nostrils maybe, or a differently shaped cavity. I stopped trying to dismantle it. The breathing held at that spot for a stretch of time my brain converted into an eternity, but that was probably under 2 minutes. And during that time I noticed this. The space inside the house was getting smaller. Not physically, but the sense of where I could exist without being perceived was contracting. When I'd first woken up, the whole room felt like neutral territory. Now the couch was an island, and the island was shrinking, and the side window was a border I couldn't stop mentally mapping even with my eyes closed. I knew where every piece of furniture was. The coffee table about 5 feet away, the old armchair near the opposite wall, the floor lamp Cody never turned on, the hallway door leading to his room, open with the crack he'd left. I focused on the crack. If I got up now, silently, without turning anything on, I could cross the room in a straight line and reach the hallway in about 8 steps. I knew this because I'd counted it mentally during the afternoon, without realizing I was counting, which is the kind of thing your body does when it's assessing routes without admitting it's assessing routes. I didn't get up, because getting up was movement, and movement was decision, and decision was an internal shift that I had learned that night did not go unnoticed. The breathing outside changed. It got even slower. If that was possible, it did. The cycle stretched to a point that felt less like resting breath, and more like the breathing of something that had gone completely still, completely focused, draining movement to concentrate some other resource. I've seen animals do that. A cat before it leaps, a dog before it bites. The stillness that isn't rest. The stillness that is accumulation. And it was at that point that I heard Cody. Not his voice, his footsteps. He was awake, moving in the bedroom, and from the sound I could tell he was heading toward the bedroom window, which was on the same wall as the living room window, maybe 10 feet between them. I wanted to shout at him to stay still. I didn't make a sound. His steps reached the window and stopped. Silence. I pictured him looking out at nothing in the dark the same way he must have stood so many other nights, and I felt something that wasn't exactly fear for myself. It was a different version. The version that appears when you understand the danger is arranged in a way that includes someone you need to protect, and you are lying motionless on a couch 8 steps away being completely useless. The breathing outside stopped. Completely. Not gradually fading, not moving away. It stopped as if it had been switched off. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it that night. It was genuinely empty. No compression, no texture of presence, as if the space outside had been returned to itself. Cody's footsteps moved back from the window to the hallway. He stopped at the crack in the door. I opened my eyes and could see his silhouette standing there, looking into the room, unable to see me in the dark. He stood there for a moment, then said quietly, "It's gone." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yeah." He went back to his room without another word. I lay there listening to the normal sounds of the night reconstitute themselves gradually. Insects, wind, the metal sheet on the barn roof tapping once, lightly, like wood cooling down. I didn't sleep again. I lay there until dawn, cataloging what I knew, which was little, and what I could no longer dismiss, which was more than I wanted. There was something large enough to be on a roof, smart enough to stop when the internal state of whoever was listening changed, and patient enough to stand outside a window in the dark for an indeterminate amount of time. Those three things together didn't fit any category I had available. When the sky began to lighten, I sat up on the couch and looked out the side window for a long time. The yard was empty. The barn was closed. The metal sheet at the corner of the roof was lifted the way it always was, and on the boards of the barn's side wall, visible now in the gray morning light, the marks I'd studied from the ladder had something different about them that I hadn't noticed before. In the lower corner, near the ground, there was a newer mark, deeper, with a shape that I looked at for a while without wanting to recognize, and then I recognized it, and I haven't said anything to anyone about it yet, and to this day I don't know if I should have. Cody made scrambled eggs in the morning and I ate without tasting them. He didn't ask how I'd slept and I didn't ask how he'd slept, because the answer was written all over both of us and didn't need words. He was in the same clothes as the day before, which told me he hadn't actually gone to sleep after going back to his room. He'd lain down dressed, ready for something he didn't know how to name. I needed to see the mark up close. I told him I was going to take a look outside. He didn't answer, but when I grabbed my jacket, he got up and came along without being asked, which told me he knew exactly what I wanted to see. The morning was cold and overcast. That kind of flat, white West Virginia sky that's neither rain nor sun, just an absence of definition. The ground between the house and the barn was damp, the sparse grass flattened by the night's moisture, and I noticed as I walked that the soil was soft enough to hold the impression of weight. I looked at the ground before I looked at the barn. There were marks in the ground. Not on the direct path between the house and the barn. That was packed dirt that doesn't give easily. But along the edge of the yard, where taller grass grew toward the tree line, there was a strip of compressed soil that ran in an irregular line parallel to the barn side wall, and then curved around toward the back wall. What I could make out weren't individual defined footprints. It was more like a sequence of depressions, spaced in a way that was neither quadruped nor human. The distance between one depression and the next was too wide for any normal human stride, and there were two types of pressure alternating, one more concentrated and pointed, and one longer, which could have been a heel or could have been something else. I stopped analyzing and went to the barn wall. The new mark was where I'd seen it from the window, in the lower left corner of the side wall near the ground. But near the ground was relative, because when I got there and knelt down to examine it, the lowest mark in the grouping was maybe 3 feet up from the soil, and the sequence climbed from there. 3 parallel lines, vertical, with roughly 4 fingers' width of spacing between them. The wood inside the marks had been torn in splinters, not cut clean, which indicated force applied by something not sharp, something that ripped rather than sliced. The depth was irregular along the length of each line, deeper at the point of entry, and shallower at the point of exit, which suggested a downward motion, top to bottom, with deceleration at the end. I keep describing it this way, technically, because that's how I process things. That's what I was doing in that moment, turning into an engineering problem something that didn't quite fit that category. Cody was standing behind me. He said, "It's newer than the others." I said I could see that, he said. "This one wasn't here 3 days ago." I ran my fingers near the edges of the mark without touching inside. The exposed wood was pale, no oxidation, no darkening from moisture. He was right. It was recent. It was from the night before. I stood up and looked at the roof. The lifted sheet at the corner was about 11 feet off the ground, and I stood there looking at the distance between that sheet and the side wall, calculating the angle, the reach, trying to build a geometry that made sense with what I'd heard during the night, the weight shifting across the roof toward the edge, and with what I was seeing now on the ground and on the wall. The geometry made sense. That was the problem. I didn't want it to. Cody said behind me, "You believe it now?" I didn't say yes. I said I needed to think, that there were explanations I hadn't fully eliminated yet. He nodded slowly, without irony, without the satisfaction of someone who's been vindicated, which was worse than if he'd said "I told you so," because it meant he had been past that point long enough that vindication didn't mean anything anymore. We stayed outside a while longer. I walked around the entire barn, examining the other marks on the walls. The back wall had a heavier concentration, more marks, deeper, some at heights I had to estimate because they were above where my hand could reach with my arm fully extended. I examined the chain on the side door up close, confirmed what I'd seen before. It was looped on the inside in a way that looked locked from a distance but wasn't. I asked Cody why the chain was like that. He said, because it doesn't lock from the outside. I asked who had put the chain there. He said he had. That in the second week, after the first nights with the sound, he'd put the chain on the door because the original door didn't close firmly. But the wood frame was rotted at the spot where you'd mount an external padlock, so the chain ended up on the inside, looped, which was the best the situation allowed. I asked what the point was of a chain on the inside of an empty barn. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's not to keep something out. It's so I know if something went in." That stayed with me in a way I couldn't resolve. We went back inside around 10. He turned on the radio. I sat at the table with my coffee looking out the back window at the barn, which from the kitchen looked completely harmless under the flat white morning light. An old structure of dark weathered wood in the middle of an open lot. Still, ordinary. I should have left. I had work on Monday, a scheduled inspection on towers in Webster County that I couldn't push. I should have left and part of me wanted to, and I stayed. I can't say exactly what made me stay. It wasn't courage, it wasn't concern for Cody, though that was there too. It was something closer to what I feel on a tower when I hear a sound I haven't identified. A specific resistance to walking away without understanding what was happening. I'm not comfortable with gaps. Never have been. The early afternoon with the sun trying to break through the overcast sky without much success. I took the ladder back to the side of the house and climbed up to the height of the barn roof, using the excuse of checking the gutter I'd fixed the day before. From up on the ladder I could see the barn roof completely. The lifted sheet at the corner had been loose for a while. The rust along the edges and the curl of the sheet indicated months, maybe more. But the rest of the metal roof had something I needed to look at for a moment before I understood what I was seeing. There were marks on the metal, not rust, not weather damage. Marks that crossed the oxidized surface of the metal in lines I recognized immediately because they were identical to the ones on the wood. 3 parallel, with 4-finger spacing, deeper at the point of entry and shallower at the point of exit. Except on the metal, the marks ran horizontally, from the edge toward the center of the roof, which meant the thing hadn't climbed up the side. It had come in from the top. I came down the ladder slowly, held the last rung a moment longer than necessary, and stood looking at the ground while I calculated the height of the barn roof. 15, maybe 16 feet, and the distance to the nearest tree line, which was about 60 feet away. The tree line was dark even in the afternoon. I couldn't see what was inside it, but I was left with a feeling, clear and unwelcome, that this difficulty was not necessarily mutual. I should have left after what I saw on the roof. That's the part I still can't explain satisfactorily. Not to my mom, not to myself. I had enough information. I had marks on the metal, marks on the wood, depressions in the soil, a whole night of sounds I could no longer attribute to any known wildlife in West Virginia. Anyone with access to that information and no emotional investment in the problem would have gotten in their car and driven away. I had emotional investment in the problem. Only mine wasn't fear. It was the gap. I still hadn't seen anything. Everything I had was indirect evidence. Marks, sounds, depressions. A chain on the inside of a door. It was more than I'd had 2 days before, but it was still the kind of thing a reasonable man could arrange into an alternative explanation if he tried with enough determination. And I had spent my entire life being a reasonable man with enough determination. So I stayed. Cody didn't say anything when I put my jacket away and said I'd have dinner with him again. He made rice and beans with smoked sausage that smelled too good for that small kitchen, and we ate listening to the radio. And around 8 he said he was going to shower and that there was a clean towel in the hallway closet if I needed one. It was deliberate normalcy. I recognized it because I ran the same mechanism. At 10:30 he went to his room. I stayed in the living room. This time I didn't try to sleep. I sat on the couch with my back straight, feet on the floor, phone in my pocket with the screen off. There was a glass of water on the coffee table I'd set there before he went to bed. There was also, and I did this without thinking too hard about what it meant, the flashlight I kept in my car. A small, solid mag light I've carried in the glove compartment for years, because transmission towers and darkness go together often in my work. I'd brought it in from the car in the afternoon and set it on the floor beside the couch. The radio was at minimum volume. Gospel again, different station, different voice. Midnight came and went with nothing. After midnight, time works differently when you're awake waiting for something. It doesn't speed up or slow down consistently. It gets irregular with minutes that pass normally, and then a block of time that vanishes without a trace. I looked at my phone at 12:45. The next time I looked it was 1:20. It was shortly after 1:20 that the radio didn't cut out. That was the difference. It kept playing clean, perfectly steady, while everything else in the house seemed to lose signal. The refrigerator stopped humming. The wall clock lagged a second on the next tick. Even the air seemed suspended. The problem wasn't the radio. It was what made the radio seem too normal. Same as the night before, it didn't turn off. The light stayed on, but the sound started coming through in fragments, gospel and static alternating with no pattern. I looked at the radio for a moment. Then I deliberately looked away toward the side window, because looking at the radio was what I wanted to do, and wanting to do something in a moment like that is reason enough to examine the impulse before giving in to it. The side window was dark. Old glass, slightly wavy, that distorted whatever was outside depending on the angle. From that distance, sitting on the couch, I saw nothing but the faint reflection of the radio's red light. The radio came back to normal, and the sound began. This time I was ready, which didn't help as much as I'd expected. Ready and hearing that thing are two states that don't add up in any useful way. The sound came back with the same quality as before, low, rhythmic, wet, too long in its cycle to belong to anything I could comfortably name. And it came from the same place, the barn side wall, moving slowly. I kept my breathing steady. The sound moved along the barn wall, reached the edge, stopped. The compressed silence. Then it came back. And this time the path was different. Instead of heading toward the house the same way it had the night before, it went first toward the tree line. I tracked the movement by the change in volume and direction, sound that fades when it recedes, and that carries its own spatial logic when you're listening with complete focus. It went to the trees, stayed quiet there for a while, and then came back, faster. The change in speed was what unlocked something inside me. Not immediate panic, but something that sat between heightened alert and the beginning of a different kind of assessment than before. On the previous nights, the movement had been slow, almost deliberate in its slowness. This had a different cadence. Not a run, but purpose. It was something that had gone to check on a reference and come back with it. The sound reached the house and stopped outside the side window. I didn't move. The breathing from outside was more audible than on the previous nights. I don't know if it was closer. I don't know if it was because the surrounding silence was denser. I don't know if it was because my hearing was calibrated now in a way it hadn't been before. I could hear the pause between the exhale and the next inhale. I could hear the moisture in it. There was a smell coming in through the bottom of the window, an old weather seal that didn't actually seal, that I hadn't noticed on the previous nights or hadn't recognized. Meat and earth and something with a metallic undercurrent, the kind of smell that sticks in the back of your throat and doesn't clear when you try to push it out. I held the flashlight, didn't turn it on, just held it. The breathing outside held still. 1 cycle, 2, 5. I was counting because counting gave structure to time, and structure to time was the only control I had available. On the 10th cycle, I realized my own breathing was syncing with it. Not intentionally, not consciously, but somewhere between the 8th and 9th cycle, my body had started mirroring the rhythm from outside. Long inhale, pause, long exhale. And when I caught that, something in my chest tightened in a way that wasn't quite fear but was a close relative. I broke the rhythm deliberately, breathed fast, shallow, out of sync. The sound outside stopped, didn't fade, didn't move away. Stopped. The same way as the night before, like a switch thrown, like a response to a shift that had produced no detectable sound whatsoever. The silence that came was total. I sat there holding the flashlight for however long it was. And something inside me, not thought, not decision, something prior to both of those, something that operates at the level where the body takes sides before the mind does, began to give way. Not all at once, in layers. Like a structure progressively losing its anchor points until the geometry can no longer hold the weight. I stood up. I don't know why I stood up. I know the flashlight was in my hand, and I was on my feet, and the 8 steps between me and the side window were the 8 longest steps I had ever considered taking in my life. I didn't take those steps. I moved toward the front window instead, on the other side of the room, on the opposite side from where the sound had been, or had been. Because when I reached the front window and looked outside, at the front yard, the dirt path leading to the road, the uniform dark that the absent moon made of that space, I saw nothing, but the front window was fogged. Not completely. A horizontal band, about 5.5 to 6 feet off the ground, fogged on the outside, from the outside, left to right across almost the full width of the glass, as if something had been standing outside that window, close enough for the warmth of its breath to reach the cold glass, long enough to leave a mark. I turned on the flashlight. The beam hit the glass and came back useless, showing only the reflection of my own hand and the fog on the surface. I pressed my forehead to the glass to block the glare and looked outside. The front yard was empty. But in the soft dirt of the flower bed running along the front wall of the house there was a mark, a single one, deep, wide, with a shape that my flashlight lit up for maybe 3 seconds before I pulled back from the glass and stood in the middle of the room with the beam pointed at the floor. I called Cody's name. Didn't plan it. It came out before any decision, from the same place things come from when control goes all at once. I called his name in a voice I didn't recognize as mine. Not in volume, but in quality, in something exposed in it that I hadn't heard in my own voice for a long time. He was at the hallway door in seconds, looked at me, looked at the flashlight, looked at the front window. I said, "We need to get out of this house right now." He didn't ask why. He grabbed the car keys from the hook by the door, didn't grab his jacket, didn't grab anything else, and went out the back door while I was still processing that we had agreed to do this without exchanging another word. I went out after him. The air outside was cold and still and smelled like wet earth, and something I knew by now, something I no longer needed to try to identify. We got to my car, got in. I started the engine and drove down the unnamed road with the high beams on until we hit the gravel road and then the asphalt, and then the 33 toward Buckhannon, and neither of us said anything for 40 minutes. What stayed with me wasn't the fog on the glass. It was the silence that came after I called out. Because when I called Cody's name, that exact moment, that peak of collapse, the sound from outside was already gone. And its absence was so absolute, so immediate, so perfectly synchronized with the moment I gave way, that I understood something I still don't know what to do with. It hadn't left because it was afraid. It had left because it was satisfied. We got to my mom's house in Buckhannon at 3 in the morning. She opened the door before we knocked, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd sensed something. She has that instinct that I never inherited and always underestimated. She looked at the two of us on the doorstep. No jackets, no bags, with the expression of someone who has already decided not to ask questions yet. She said, "Come in." She made tea that neither of us asked for, and that both of us drank. Cody slept in the room that had been his whole childhood. I slept on the living room couch, which was shorter than I was long, but was the safest place I'd set foot in days. I woke up at 9 to the smell of eggs, and the sound of my mom's radio playing a local news station she's listened to every morning for as long as I can remember. Those sounds did something for me that I didn't expect. Cody came downstairs around 10, still in the clothes from the day before, hair uncombed, but there was something different in his face. Not quite relief, but the absence of a specific tension I had gotten used to seeing in him without realizing I was seeing it. Like when a chronic pain lifts and you only understand its size by the absence. My mom made pancakes, The three of us ate together at the kitchen table with the radio in the background, and for a while the conversation was about things that didn't matter at all. The roof on her house that needed attention, a distant cousin who just had a baby, the neighbor's dog that barked every morning at the same time with a consistency she found both irritating and oddly reassuring. I heard her talk about the dog and didn't say anything. After coffee, when my mom went out to run errands, Cody and I sat at the table. He stared at the last of the coffee in his cup for a while, then said, "You saw something." It wasn't a question. It was the same construction he used when he already knew the answer. I said I'd seen the mark in the flower bed. He nodded slowly, asked what it looked like. I described it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he'd seen similar marks in the same flower bed 2 months before, that they'd disappeared after a heavy rain, and that he'd taken a photo on his phone, but the photo didn't show what the eyes showed, which is the problem with photographing certain things with certain devices. I asked to see the photo anyway. He got his phone, searched, showed me. There it was. A poorly lit, slightly out-of-focus image showing dark earth with a depression in the center that could have been anything depending on who was looking. I stared at it for a while, handed it back without comment. I asked if he'd gone to the police. He said he'd called once in the first few weeks, that the person who answered had listened patiently and asked if there was any property being trespassed or any material damage. He said there were marks on a wall. The dispatcher said they could send someone to pass by the property during the night patrol. Nobody came, or someone came and found nothing, and he didn't call again. I understood. I would have given the same response as that dispatcher. I stayed in Buchanan until Sunday afternoon. During that time, I called my supervisor and rescheduled the Webster County inspection to Tuesday. Cody spent most of the time in his room, actually sleeping for the first time in weeks. I could tell by the different quality of silence that came from there, by the way he came down for Saturday lunch with less depth under his eyes. Sunday morning, I drove out to see Earl Dunning. I went to Helvetia alone, didn't tell Cody where I was going, and pulled up to his property, which was larger and better kept than I'd expected. A working farm with cattle, 2 barns of his own, a stone house that must have been 80 well-preserved years old. He met me on the porch without surprise, as if he'd expected me to come back. We sat down. He offered coffee and I accepted. His 3 dogs stayed lying on the porch floor through the whole conversation, quiet, watching me with the specific attention of animals that assess without showing they're assessing. I asked how long he'd been noticing the dogs going quiet at night. He thought about it, said the first episode he could date with any certainty had been in March. Before that, maybe 2 episodes he'd chalked up to something else. I asked if he'd ever seen anything. He was quiet for a stretch that was long, then said, "Once. In February, before I connected the episodes to your brother. I was coming out of the barn at 6 in the morning and I saw something heading into the tree line about 100 yards out. Didn't get a good look. It was getting light, but there was still fog. I asked what it looked like. He looked at me with the pale, tired eyes of someone who had weighed his words carefully before choosing them. He said, "Tall, upright, but not the way we stand upright." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I drove back to Buchanan, had dinner with my mom and Cody, and left for Weston in the early evening. At the door, Cody watched me leave with an expression I still don't know quite how to classify. It wasn't gratitude. It was something closer to the recognition between 2 men who have been through the same thing and will have to carry it separately because there's no language for carrying it together. I said I'd call. He said okay. 12 days later, he disappeared. My mom called on a Wednesday morning saying Cody hadn't picked up in 3 days. I said he was probably fine, that he went like that sometimes, that I'd try him on WhatsApp. I tried. The messages showed 1 check mark only. Undelivered, which meant no signal or the phone was off. I waited a day, tried again. Same result. On the 5th day without contact, I called the Randolph County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation. They sent a car out to the Helvetia property. They called me back 2 hours later saying the house was locked up, Cody's car was in its spot, there was no sign of a break-in or any violence, and no neighbor had seen anything unusual in the past few days. I asked if they'd checked the barn. The deputy paused for a moment, said yes. The door was secured with a chain, and there was no reason to force entry into a secondary structure without evidence of a crime. I didn't say anything about the chain, not because it didn't matter. It mattered too much. But I knew how it was going to sound if I tried to explain that a chain on the wrong side meant more than a chain on the wrong side. I had learned too late how certain truths lose their weight when you say them to the wrong person. I drove out to Helvetia the next day. The house was exactly as the deputy had described. Locked, tidy, no sign of hurry or disorder. Cody's car was parked beside it, with a thin layer of dust and leaves caught near the wipers. It didn't look like it had been abandoned for months. It looked worse than that. It looked like it had been left there in the middle of a routine that someone interrupted without warning. The radio on top of the refrigerator was off for the first time since I'd arrived the week before, which unsettled me more than anything else I found that afternoon. The barn had the chain looped around the handle and the latch, on the outside. I stood in front of it for a long time. The chain Cody had installed on the inside was now on the outside, looped the same way, with the same pattern, but on the wrong side. There was no way it could have gotten there without someone removing it from inside and putting it back from the outside, or without something doing that. I didn't open the door. I'm not entirely sure why I didn't. I tell myself it was because I didn't want to disturb a scene the police might need to preserve, and that's partially true. But the other part is that I stood in front of that door with my hand 10 inches from the chain, and something in my body refused. Not thought, not decision. The same mechanism prior to reason that had gotten me up off the couch the night I called out. I went back to my car and called the police again. They came back, opened the barn, checked it out. It was empty. No Cody, no sign of Cody, nothing that explained the chain on the outside or where my brother had gone. One of the deputies asked if Cody had disappeared before, whether he'd been depressed, whether he had debts, whether he used anything, whether there was someone he might have gone off with. The questions were too human for what had happened there, and for exactly that reason they seemed useless. I said I didn't know. That was 8 months ago. Cody is still missing. The case is open, classified as a voluntary missing adult, which is the classification police use when there's no evidence of a crime and there's no body. My mom calls every Sunday. I pick up every Sunday and tell her there's nothing new, that I'm keeping track of things, that someone will know something at some point. I believe parts of that. 3 weeks ago, my phone showed a notification from the family shared album. Cody added one item. I stared at that long enough for the screen to go dark in my hand. Cody had been missing for 8 months. His phone had been listed as off in the report. His carrier said the number had shown no activity since the week he disappeared. Even so, there was a new photo in the album. It was a poorly lit, slightly out of focus image, the same kind of image Cody had shown me at my mom's kitchen table that Sunday morning. Dark earth, low fog, a tree line in the background that I recognized even without wanting to, because it's the kind of recognition the body makes before the mind confirms it. The Helvetia property, taken at night from inside the yard, facing the tree line. In the center of the image, partially obscured by the fog and the distance, there was an upright shape, tall, with proportions I stared at for a long time, trying to reorganize into something familiar, trying to find the perspective error, the vanishing point, any lens distortion that would correct the structure. But the more I zoomed in, the more the shape stayed wrong in the same way. It wasn't an elongated shadow. It wasn't a blur. It was a body whose geometry made no effort to look animal or human. It simply obeyed an engineering I didn't recognize. I didn't find one. I called my mom before opening the full image. She didn't pick up, so I opened it alone. I don't know if Cody took that photo. I don't know if someone took that photo with his phone. I don't know if the shape at the center of the image was facing toward the camera or away from it, because the proportions don't make it clear where a face would be, or whether there was a face, or what exactly in something like that would correspond to that word. What I know is that the photo was taken at night, with the phone aimed at the tree line, about 40 yards from the barn, and that whoever took it was standing, was awake, was paying attention.